Hi, I'm Sharon Croft. We're going to be discussing part two of the scientific evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So, we're going to be discussing scientific evidence for the Shroud of Turin, which is an object specifically related to the physical resurrection of Jesus. Um, I believe in citing my sources. For a complete list of my references, please email me at this address, croftmeeph412@gmail.com. They're also provided at the end. So, is a Shroud of Turin a forgery? Most of us are quite happy with the way that our science is progressing. We can catch the criminals who were associated with murders and terrible events that happened a few decades ago because of the advance of science. And most of us agree that when something is presented before a court of law, if something is presented as truth for our medical situation or for um, in criminal type of trials, anything that's presented as truth, science-based truth, should have correct scientific method. Well, in 1988, the Vatican authorized testing of the Shroud of Turin. A small corner of the shroud was cut and radiocarbon dated by the laboratories. Each date gave a range between 1260 and 1390, which contradicted the STRUP's previous conclusions of possible authenticity. Remember, STRUP stands for Shroud of Turin Research Project. Proverbs 18 tells us, the first to plead his case seems right until another comes and examines him. Standards developed in 1985 require radiocarbon dating from 3 samples of cloth, but only 1 sample was taken from the shroud. Furthermore, it was taken from the edge, the area most likely to be contaminated, an area that was later proven to have been rewoven with newer threads according to standard fabric repair techniques known as French reweaving. I've seen that in action, and it weaves new threads and with the old cloth in such a way that you can't tell the difference, or the untrained person cannot tell the difference between the old and new. So, what are the conclusions from the testing done according to the proper procedure? In 2005, Raymond Rogers from the Los Alamos National Laboratory and director of chemistry for the Shroud of Turin research project tested samples from the main body of the shroud. And his research showed the samples were not the same as the sample that was tested first. The radiocarbon sample was not part of the original cloth of the Shroud of Turin. The radiocarbon date was thus not valid for determining the true age of the shroud. What does verifiable research conclude? In 2004, textile expert Methchild Fleury Limburg verified it's a style common of first-century Israel and comparable to the shrouds used at Masada. Masada was the community in rebellion to Rome that was living at the top of a mesa in Israel at the time of Jesus. In 2013, researchers at Padua University in Italy determined a date range between 280 BC and 228 AD, which of course includes the time of Jesus' death in first century Israel. Then in 2014, the team narrowed down the date to the first century. The studies are peer-reviewed. To date, no one has discovered errors in the methodology of these findings. So the original testing was done by the wrong method. Studies done by the correct method have shown dates consistent with the time of the death of Jesus Christ. We could even narrow down the date. Flowers bloom in the spring, of course. The examination of the pollen on both the shroud and the sidarum of Ovidio, that would be the face cloth of Jesus, show pollen from the types of flowers found only in the region of Jerusalem and bloom only in the spring in the weeks surrounding Passover. So we know that this burial cloth was used during the Passover season, which happens to be the resurrection season. They overlap. Remember Christ our Passover? The pollen studies were done by Avinuam Danan, and he is a professor at Hebrew University. He happens to be Jewish, and he doesn't have any reason for artificially coming to a false conclusion to support the Shroud of Turin. He's doing it based on science, not on his personal religious or national religious belief. So was the shroud a clever artistic forgery? Remember the first photographer, a forensic photographer who, I think his name is Bart Erdman, who photographed the shroud, was expecting to see brushstrokes, expecting to see that it was a forgery, and he and his colleagues discovered it was not a forgery. No substances were manually applied to the cloth. There was no paint, no dye, or other artistic medium to form the anatomically perfect 3D image. No brushstrokes, no evidence of rubbing. The image was not formed by human effort. Here's a citation. I can also email it to you if you need it. So what do we know? Blood from the Shroud of Turin is type AB. It was typical of first century Jews, but very rare in other populations. The victim was a male, age 30 to 33 inclusive. When wrapped, the body was 5'11" and weighed 175 pounds. The estimated height of the shroud man was between 175 and 180 centimeters. It corresponds with the average height of 178 centimeters of the adult male skeletons excavated in the first century cemetery near Jerusalem. The top archaeologist on that project was Haas, and the project occurred in 1970. This height also corresponds with the ideal male height of 176 centimeters, according to an interpretation of the Talmud by Cross, made in 1910 to 1911. These studies were published by the University of Chicago Press. They're the ones who published the study on the cemetery. And by the way, University of Chicago is not a Christian university. They're not a Catholic university. They have no reason to do anything to support evidence for the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So they were not doing this from a religious perspective, just, hey, here's archaeology. The Shroud of Turin was photographed with multiple highly sophisticated cameras. Some images seem to show Roman coins on the eyes. Now, one of the people who objected to the first presentation mentioned the Roman coins and said they wouldn't have had Roman coins. Jews would consider that an idol. Not necessarily. Remember, Luke chapter 20, verse 24 confirms that the Jews carried Roman coins. When they were questioning Jesus about taxes, he said, take out a coin and see whose picture is on it. The Air Force scientists photographed the shroud with a VP-8 image analyzer designed for NASA. It discovered that the shroud contains three-dimensional data. The Roman coins in the eyes is consistent with archaeological investigation of first century Israel graves, according to the University of Chicago Press. So what does it show? The shroud shows that a portion of his beard had been pulled out. His cheeks were bruised and swollen. Every bloodstain on the Shroud of Turin is consistent with the torture and crucifixion of Jesus as described in the New Testament. There is no doubt that the victim, once wrapped in the shroud, had been beaten with the Roman scourge, which struck him at least 125 times. Now, remember, these were Roman thugs. The Jews, if they were chastising someone, they had a limit to the number of blows they could deliver if they were delivering punishment. These Roman guys were not subject to any such rules. Their only rule was torture. He had been nailed through the wrist and feet. A Roman spear had pierced his side after he died. The circumference of his head had puncture wounds consistent with the crown of thorns, and even pollen from the crown of thorn plant. The shroud contains traces of limestone unique to Jerusalem. Blood chemistry on the shroud proves that the man in the shroud was dead at the time of wrapping. So let's review the facts that we know so far. Science confirms that both the shroud and sidarum are used on the same body in the 1st century AD. Textiles and scientific dating proves 1st century. The pollen shows they were used in the Passover season in Israel. The limestone fragments on the shroud are specific to Jerusalem. The victim was a Jewish male with type AB blood, age 30 to 33 inclusive. The victim had been severely flogged. The victim died by crucifixion and asphyxia, which is basically being so tired he couldn't breathe. He had been pierced through the wrist and feet. The victim was in the shroud for no more than 2 days, as the Shroud of Turin has no evidence of decomposition gases. This is was predicted in Psalm 16, verse 10. Please read it for yourself. But some people say, well, the Romans crucified thousands of people. That could have been anyone. It's true. The Shroud of Turin and Sidarum have markings consistent with any Jewish man who was crucified by the Romans in the 1st century Jerusalem in Passover, who happened to be between the ages of 30 and 33. However, injuries consistent with the crown of thorns and piercing by a spear are specific to Jesus, as is the partially plucked beard. Furthermore, the shroud shows unbroken legs, which are also specific to Jesus. The body being in the shroud for 2 days is specific to Jesus, as predicted in the book of Hosea. I'll give you that reference later. The church interest in preserving the relic or the shroud itself is specific to Jesus. The history of the sidarum is tied specifically to Jesus, and scientists has provided a link between the two. Any court of law examining the evidence has more than enough evidence to show that they were used on the same body. Now, Matthew 27, 51 through 53 tells us that other people were resurrected when Jesus got out of his grave. So could it have been one of their shrouds? I don't think so. First of all, they were not crucified in the same way that Jesus was. And those people got out of their graves and they went into the city. With Jesus, the people went to his grave. If the shrouds of those people who resurrected, if they were found, unlike the shroud of Jesus, they would have been untouched or discarded as unclean because the law of Moses rules about blood applied to everyone except Jesus. Remember, Jesus' blood cleanses, other blood is dirty. The DNA on the shroud indicates a virgin birth. In 2007, Tripler, a scientist with Strupp, reanalyzed the data and determined that that which was previously considered to be contaminated blood to be the result of a male with the XX chromosome containing the SRY gene indicative of a virgin birth. In other words, there's a gene mutation that can allow a woman to have a child without contact with a man. The DNA, of course, it's very, very rare. But the DNA on the shroud indicated that the person in that the that was contained in the shroud had that kind of chromosome, that he was his mother had that gene mutation, and that he was born of a virgin. Science tells us that the absence of blood smears shows the body was not stolen. The body was in the shroud for not more than 2 days. Please see Hosea 6:1 and 2. According to science, the image on the shroud was formed by an electromagnetic event, which has not been repeated by science. There was an earthquake, and the stone rolled away. According to Matthew 28:2, the energy produced by the resurrection was sufficient to produce an earthquake. The energy that formed on the shroud was formed by energy sufficient to produce an earthquake. The conclusions are the event defies the known laws of science. The image was created as the body disappeared in a burst of energy, as the body was transported to another dimension, while the shroud simultaneously collapsed. The energy that caused the image came from inside the body. I've read multitudes of studies upon studies from the Shroud of Turin project, and these are direct quotes. These are NASA qualified scientists. Some of them actually work for NASA, and they did the math. They say the event took about 90 nanoseconds. A nanosecond is 1 billionth of a second. So it's 10 to the power of -9. This is their math problem. ER equals MS times N times C3 equals 7. 10 times 18. 10 times the -9 equals 7. 10 times 9J. I don't understand all that, but I'm glad that somebody does. This energy is about 10,000 times smaller than that released by the Hiroshima bomb, but still equivalent to 1.82 tons of TNT, capable of destroying the tomb and a 50-mile radius. So that doesn't mean that it destroyed the tomb, but it had that capability, but the energy was focused in the body itself. The results of the Shroud of Turin research project tell us the shroud is the authentic burial cloth of Jesus. The only way to be more certain is to have Jesus himself offer DNA for comparison. The image is not it's not man-made. It is the result of an electromagnetic radiation event which occurred when the body had been in it for not more than 2 days. The body disappeared when the radiation was emitted. Romans 8 tells us if the same Spirit that raised Christ from the dead lives in you, it will quicken your mortal body. Quicken means make alive, mortal means dead. So if you have the Spirit that Jesus had, you will be raised from the dead. 1 Corinthians 15 tells us, but now Christ is risen from the dead and has become the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For since by man came death, by man also came the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ all shall be made alive, but each one in his own order, Christ the first fruits, after those who are Christ at his coming. So when Jesus comes, make sure that you are his. Then comes the end, when he delivers the kingdom to God the Father, when he puts an end to all rule and authority and power. That means everybody who's king right now, or in some kind of power right now, or who thinks they have power, that's going to come to an end, and that person and that political system will be subject to the rule of Jesus Christ. For he must reign until he has put all enemies under his feet. The last enemy that will be destroyed is death. When the dead are raised, what will happen to you? That's the question. Jesus Christ died. He was resurrected. He ascended into heaven, and he will return. When he returns, will you be ready? Or if you happen to physically die before that, are you ready to meet Jesus Christ in person? I hope so. If you would like a copy of my notes and citations, please send me an email. My address is croftmeeph412@gmail.com. And I will just show you the references for anybody who wants to stop his or her screen. Okay, you can stop it and look at those. You can stop it and look at these. You can stop it and look at these, or you can send me an email and I'll gladly send them to you. Have a great evening and be ready for the return of Jesus Christ or your own passing before then. God bless you.